This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions, gamers dominate the tabletop, and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hail and well met, operatives and friends of the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm Don Chisholm, here with my co-host Robin Patterson.
Woohoo! And I'm Jeff Wood, as a guest. I kind of jumped in there.
That's okay, it's taking the initiative. What we'll be doing tonight, we'll be talking about small press comics and self-publishing. And that's why we've brought Jeff along, because he is the creator of the comic Snowbuni, as well as other works. And he's got a lot of insight into the history of small press comics up to the modern scene.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to be here, and I appreciate your bringing me on board, and look forward to sharing what I know, whatever I can. I'm probably not the expert on this field. I can think of some other people like Ed Vick, who is involved in so many aspects of publishing, and he's one of those guys that's kind of central. So kind of like going forward, you might want to think about having him on sometime. But right here, right now, I'd be happy to share what I know.
Cool. And that's...
Oh, don't worry. He's on a list.
He's on... Sorry. We'll hit him up later, yeah.
Exactly. He's on the list. Don't worry. He'll be dealt with.
Guys aren't supposed to talk about the list.
He's the publisher of MU Press, and MU Press is kind of the outfit that I've worked with the most often for publishing my own work in the independent scene.
See, that's interesting, because I always pronounced it moo.
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 Well, their slogan is "Party until the cows come home, then moo." That was Hal Hargett's little addition to MU Press back in the 1980s when they first came up with it. I think that was actually on some of his literature that he first came up with when he changed MU Press to being independent, because before that it was his the name of his small press publishing venture. And of course,
so
Moo
originally it wasn't a comic book publisher?
Originally it was a small press name, and it was for his little mini comics that he did, and they were like little esoteric mini comics, and they didn't really have a theme. They were just kind of little snippets of artwork and observations, and it was called Miscellanea Unlimited, MU, which is where we get Moo. Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yep. And that was back when he lived. Actually, he was from Texas, and then he moved up to Seattle about the same time I did, and that's where we met. Actually, he lived about a mile away from me when we were both in Seattle. So it was real convenient for me to just walk over to his house. And Ed's place was always the center of the comic book universe in Seattle, Washington. Every time I went over there was publishers there and comic book artists and people just hanging out. And there was always videos on the TV, and there was piles of comic books around that you could read. And there was Chinese takeout within, one block and all sorts of things. So it was always very informative to go over there and meet the other people that he had kind of hanging around in his place. Very, very social guy, very knowledgeable, pretty much knew everybody that was in the scene in Seattle and a lot of people elsewhere. You could say a name to him, like you could say, Reed Waller, and Ed would say like something like, back when I had lunch with him 2 weeks ago, kind of thing. It was, he always seemed to know everybody and have good stories to share about them.
Well, hold on. Was Seattle then the hotbed of like the indie comic scene in the 1980s?
As far as I was concerned, it was. I was going to University of Washington in the 1980s in Seattle, and I was actually in an apartment not too far from Ed. And what had happened was, as far as small press, there was a small press review zine called Kevin Collier's Fandom Times. And he advertised that, as I recall, in CBG, which is the Comic Buyer's Guide. And he was reaching these people that wanted to be in the comics industry but really didn't have an in. And what they would do is they would put together their own little self-published things, and they would send them to Kevin Collier. He would review them, give them a grade, make encouraging words, and publish this as a little publication, little mini comic. And people would buy it for $1.50 each or something like that and subscribe. And as I recall, Kevin Collier was a journalist, so this was something that he could do kind of like on a semi-pro, semi-professional way. And he had a lot of subscribers, and he started to build this core of people that were producing their own photocopied fanzines.
Right.
And fanzines, as I understand it, like back in the the 70s, fanzines were literally they were fan comics of existing professional characters. Like somebody would have an idea for a great Superman story, so they would illustrate their own little Superman story, their own Batman story, or whatever, and they would mimeograph it. Back in the day, this was mimeograph, when you'd stick the papers in there and turn the handle, and you'd make these mimeographs, which, as you recall, they were kind of awful copies because it was literally a template you'd put in there, and you'd get ink everywhere and everything. But they would fold these and staple these, and that was your comic book, and it was cheap. It could be done at home. There was no real serious cost to it. And then in the 80s, and I think this is where the big change in the way small press publishing happened, in the 80s, photocopies, Xerox-type copies became the norm, and they became cheap enough that anybody could do it. And I think that was that, and the fact that people were starting to get organized. There was this explosion of people doing their own. They were still called fanzines, but they weren't necessarily, kind of like these underground copies of professional characters, but they were also people's original creations and their original comic book art. And we stopped calling them fanzines. Eventually, we started calling them mini comics, because usually you'd take these copies, you would fold them and staple them in the middle somehow. Yeah, a lot of saddle staplers were purchased at about that time. And you would market them through places like Kevin Collier's Fandom Times. Now, and getting back to Ed Vic's MU Press, Kevin Collier one day called it quits. He says, okay, that's it, I'm done. And what happened is that me and several other guys were driving home from a local comic book meeting of a group called the Cartoonist Northwest. And we're saying, like, man, somebody needs to start publishing a review zine or something so that everybody can know what everybody else is doing. I mean, this is back before the internet. There's no way for people to know unless there's some kind of hub where information is shared. So Ed Vic and I and Hal Hargett, another guy, we said, hey, let's do one ourselves, and we'll bring Wade Busby and a friend of ours as the paste-up guy. And the four of us, I was going to do letters, and Ed was going to do editing, and Hal Hargett was going to do the interviews, and we'll do this review zine and kind of pull together the small press publishing scene. And so we did for several years. We published the Comics FX, which stands for condoms, or not condoms, but Comics Fan Examiner. That's a story for a different time. But anyway, people would subscribe to this tabloid. And it had all sorts of information. It had advertisements, it had cartoons, it had reviews, it had interviews, it had artwork, it had all this fun stuff. And it was about people who did their own comic books, mostly small press and some independents. And that's kind of my entry into publishing. Self-publishing was originally through Kevin Collier's Fandom Times, and then through working on, as a part of the Seattle Four. We called ourselves the Seattle Four because there was four of us who were kind of co-editors. Right. Publishing this tabloid. So anyway, that's the long form, but that's how I got into it.
Okay. Right. How many issues of Comics FX actually got published?
Well, we published several years worth, and I think it was 2.5 years worth, and I think we only published 14 issues in that time because it was kind of sporadic. We published whenever we were complete with an issue, and we all had different schedules. And Ed set up an office, and we all just kind of showed up at that office, and we worked whenever we could. And when we all felt that we were more or less finished, we'd run it down to the printer and print off a couple thousand of these on newsprint, and then mail them out. And so it was, kind of there was more of them at first, but then it kind of started tapering off. And eventually we quit publishing altogether, and it just kind of ground to a halt. But by that time, there were several other independent review zines going on, too. Mm-hmm. So we weren't the only game in town. But we did a lot of, we reviewed a lot of small press comics. We got to know a lot of the creators. Mm-hmm. It was a very, it was a fun time. It was exhausting on one hand, but on the other side, we met a lot of people. We gained some notoriety.
Yeah.
But, so, and then I believe Toivo Rovinen, another cartoonist in Seattle, he picked it up and did a couple issues on his own. God help him. It was he was going to do on his own what the four of us couldn't really carry by ourselves on a part-time basis. But he did a couple issues, too.
Okay, well, quick question. Was it distributed only through the mail? Is that the only way they actually went out, to just subscribers through the mail?
We had subscribers through the mail, but Vic had contacts in the distribution industry. So I believe we were distributed through some of the big, like Capital and Diamond, and also some of the newsprint ones. Because I remember walking by some of the magazine kiosks in the University District in Seattle and seeing the Comics FX on the racks there. So I know he was able to get it out in several other places. I didn't have much to do with that. It was mostly Ed, Vic, and Hal Hargett. They knew people and were able to get this out. And I don't know.
Sorry to interrupt. I just say that because I think I actually remember seeing it in our local comic shops here in London, Ontario.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were around for a while, and I think we had, at the top of our subscription, we had like 2,000 or 4,000 copies that were going out, which is not a whole lot. But these are people who are really active. Yeah, it's enough to keep going. And we got an awful lot of letters and a lot of mail and a lot of copies of review copies and whatnot. So a lot of feedback.
That's very cool.
Yeah, it was fun for the time.
Yeah. It's interesting too because it sounds a lot like what happened in the 60s. That the underground comics, a lot of them started as reviews or parodies, or even extra stories from other characters. And then the people who were doing them started doing their own things. And their method of printing and distribution sounds like what you guys were doing with the small press stuff for a lot of it.
Yeah, that was back in the mimeograph day.
Yeah.
And I also know people who actually did comics by they would actually take like comic book pages and they put several carbon copies behind it and they'd trace it.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's very, very, very small print runs of that.
Yeah.
But I remember Ed showing me some of his like mini or small press stuff from like the 60s, and some of it was actually large print numbers, but they were usually like drug or sex comics. They were the underground scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So a little bit different from the small press comics that I was familiar with in the 1980s, which were mostly like people's serious attempt to be a cartoonist like the people they admired.
Yeah. But I'm wondering if that came about because a lot of the companies, the undergrounds, ended up being distributed in like the head shops, the counterculture stores. And
I think you're right.
Yeah.
That was they had a very limited distribution. You couldn't just put those in your average magazine kiosk. They had to be behind the counter or something.
Yeah, and even then it would be the people that were buying them would be the counterculture types, and that, I think, influenced a lot of the material and the people who got in.
Exactly.
That explains R. Crumb.
Yeah.
Exactly. His style was very indicative of that genre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of the lumpy, sticky-looking art that he was famous for.
Yeah.
And then the irony was he started doing cards. He did, like, Hallmark cards and stuff.
Say again, I didn't hear that.
Oh, with like Robert Crumb, he started doing like greeting cards. That was
really?
Yeah, that's where he and then the comics that he started swaying towards, it was because he was just really sick of the happy crappy family stuff.
Oh, I thought he was making maybe like sticky drug and sex comics for the Hallmark cards or something. I thought, wow, I haven't heard of those. But, there might be a market for those nowadays. You never know.
Could be.
Mark does everything else.
Hardcore greeting cards, you know. for the stoner in your life.
I could totally see that. Well, it'd be for, what is that, 420?
Uh-huh.
Those would be the perfect cards to send out.
Yeah,
everybody
420
on,
cards.
420. Yeah.
I don't doubt that there is something like that.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with 420 cards, but it wouldn't surprise me.
I don't think you give cards on 420. You give other things.
Oh, say again, Don?
Oh, because like 420, isn't that the that's the National Weed Day?
International Weed Day, I think.
Is it? Yeah, because that
it
was.
Might be the. I don't know if it's the International Weed Day, but I know that 420 was. I think it was the. It was the code, like the police code for a marijuana infraction.
Yeah, and that was why they decided. Was that Jennifer? It's like April 20th. Yeah, it became
April 20th. Yeah.
But that's kind of interesting. Now, it's also interesting too because looking at the undergrounds, how when you started getting into the 70s, the 80s, a lot of them became legit. Like Kitchen Sink came out of that tradition, and they became a regular like comic company. And I think Fantagraphics as well had its origins there.
Really?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
I think somebody who was instrumental, that was the tradition they came out of. And I think of that because a lot of the names that you're mentioning from when you guys were all doing the small press, they're people who are still around, and they're people that you hear from them. They're not big and flashy, but if you're into like the comic scene or even a lot of the like the nerdly arts, you'll see these people's names pop up a whole lot, even if you're not consciously aware.
Huh. Yeah, Fantagraphics, they actually moved up to Seattle while I was living there. And
really?
They were not too far away, and of course they all knew Ed. I was in. Ed took me to one of their parties one time. I wasn't really invited, but I crashed one of the Fantagraphics parties. And the one thing I remember from that, I don't think I've ever seen so much liquor in one place in my entire life. Like, I brought a couple bottles myself, and I went to the kitchen, and man, I tell you, there must have been over 1,000 bottles in there. Most of them either half drunk or half spilled, or yeah, it was quite the scene.
Whatever gets you.
And it was all gone by the end of the party.
I don't know. I didn't stay that long. Ed and I didn't. We just kind of hung out for a little while. And of course, he knew everybody, and I didn't. But we just kind of hung out.
Yeah, because that's the thing I remember. Like when you had your website, and the people that would post on it, they were all the people like that I've been reading their comics for years, and people who'd done art for different role-playing games that I remember, and there were other people who had done other projects like that I'd seen mentioned in like other places.
Uh-huh.
And I always thought that was interesting that you see that there's these waves that seem to come out of these groups, and people insinuate themselves into the industry as a whole.
Uh-huh. Who do you remember from my website that would be a good example of that?
Well, Mike Sagara has done a lot of stuff that I like. I called him a smut merchant once. That was like the high point of my day.
Yeah, Mike Sagara, actually, I forget when we met, but his style was a lot like Stan Sakai, who did Usagi Yojimbo.
Yes.
And I don't know if you remember, like Mike Sagara started doing a series called Hey Neaters.
Yep.
I don't know if you remember that or have seen that.
Yeah, I remember that.
But it was kind of a anthropomorphic slice of life comic.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful comic, and he quit doing it, and I kept kind of nudging him. I'm saying, hey, you should really do some more of that. He also did work for MU Press, Shanda the Panda.
Yep.
Didn't Shanda the Panda actually come out from Antarctic Press for a while?
Let me see. Was it the first issue? Was it the first issue that went through Antarctic Press, or was it?
Because I read it with Antarctic Press. I didn't read it with Moo. I read like an issue or two with Antarctic Press.
Oh, I remember now.
And that's what I remember him from.
Because it started with Moo.
I think the first issue came out with Moo, but they had such, the one with the Schwarzenegger cover.
Yeah.
And they had some production problems, and it took a lot longer than they thought it would. And I guess that Mike Curtis decided it would be better to go with Antarctic Press. I'm kind of peripherally aware of what happened there. I really can't guess, but it was removed from ME Press and taken to Antarctic Press, AP.
Right.
And I think now, I think, I don't know if Shanda is still being published or not, but I know Mike Curtis had his own independent title or imprint for a while. I don't know if he's still doing that.
Yeah, I don't know.
I haven't talked to him.
Yeah, I don't know if he's doing that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, because he's writing actually the Dick Tracy newspaper strip now.
Yes, I've seen that. I have seen his work. He was a big Dick Tracy fan, and he's a big Superman fan too. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he's also a writer. He's a professional writer.
Yeah.
He's written. Oh, he's not going to like me for this. He wrote some comics, like he wrote New Kids on the Block, the comic book for that.
Really?
I don't know if I was supposed to tell you that. But, yeah, he was a professional comic book writer, and he took some assignments that were, I guess, nobody else really wanted to do.
Yeah. Because that's like I say, he's one of them.
Well, someone's got to do it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a dirty job, but there it is.
Because the other one I was surprised at on your site was Kyle Miller.
Oh, yes. Kyle and I go way, way back. He's another one of those guys that I've known him for so long that I can't even hardly remember when we first met, And Kyle Miller has worked in animation. He's worked on quite a few gaming platforms. He's done, I think it was Steve Jackson games. He did a lot of artwork for them. And then he did some artwork for me. He also did some games for me. He did some little animated clips for me, and on my site that is no longer up right now. That's another story. But, yeah, he was real prolific for a while. He's having some health problems right now, which is why we don't hear as much from him anymore. But I haven't heard from him for quite a while now.
Yeah, because he invented Uncle Al.
Go ahead.
Yeah, he did the Uncle Al for Car Wars.
Uncle Al.
Yeah, are you familiar with Steve Jackson's Car Wars game?
No, just by reputation only.
Okay, because what they did, the idea was it was in the future and armed vehicles were a necessity and a sport, and Uncle Al was the one of the big suppliers of parts equipment, and it was the extra equipment books that they did them like a catalog.
Uh-huh.
And Kyle was the guy who did all the art for all of those. I had no idea.
Oh, yeah, he did several books, as well as Car Wars, as I recall. As a matter of fact, I think he was like Steve Jackson's #1 illustrator for the longest time.
Yeah, up until the 90s when they got that Smith guy.
Well, I think Mr. Miller, he started to work for, I forget the name of the company now. He did, who did the pinball games? Like early, like mid-'80s, late 80s?
Bally?
No, these were like online games, like pinball games that you would buy and play on your computer.
Oh, shoot. That I don't know.
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Yeah, but he was doing a lot of work for he did all of the like the concepts for the game boards, and he did the animations for them, and the actual mechanics of the game were designed by other people. But he used to have a gallery of the games that he built.
Huh.
Or he designed online. I don't know if he still does that.
Yeah. That's kind of an odd segue, but from comics to pinball.
Yeah, I'm looking here. High Voltage Software in Illinois, that's one of them.
Okay. Because he did a lot, because he designed a lot of mini games, as I recall.
He actually was designing games that using kind of off-the-shelf software for his own site, like Burger Builder is one of them I remember, where it's a memory game. It'll show you a menu, and then you have to recreate the burger on the grill, and you have an animated chef, that's building these things and whatnot, and you get points for doing it right.
Right.
And these were not done for anybody else. These were not done under contract. These were just for his own amusement.
Right.
And for his own site.
And that was a Game
I think
Creature.
you can still find some of those online.
Yeah.
Yeah, GameCreature.com.
Yeah, because that was also like a mini comic too that he was doing, wasn't it?
He did quite a few mini comics, but I don't think he had a character that there's cartoonists who draw a little bit of everything, and then there are cartoonists who have like one or two characters or a scenario that they work on for years and years and years. And he was one of those guys that worked on a little bit of everything.
Right.
He did mini comics. He did real comics. I don't know. I think he even did things like greeting cards, but I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. In advertising.
Right.
He's a graphic design professional.
Yeah. Because advertising's where the big money is.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if a lot of people realize that.
Well, that and designing games, that used to be like a 6-figure job from what I understand, although I think it's less than that now, because you used to have real serious, there wasn't as much competition for it as there is now.
Yeah.
But he's been working in that industry for a long time. So you knew Mike Sagara and you knew Kyle Miller. Who else rings a bell there that you knew from my site?
Well, there was Jason Waltrip.
Yes, Jason Waltrip. He did Robotech. He did the artwork for that. And he did a series called Metal Bikini.
Yeah.
He's another one of those guys that has done a little bit of everything. And last I heard, he was working on like 3 different web comics for other artists. He would take over their web comic and just do the artwork for their stories, for their script that they presented to him. And he's developed kind of this Archie Dan DiCarlo style, which actually works for a lot of the slice of life comics out there.
Yeah, because he's currently doing art for the Dangerously Chloe webcomic.
Yeah, that's one I'm not familiar with. I haven't been following that one.
It's actually pretty funny, and it's interesting because his style, you can tell it's him. But he hasn't changed any of the designs that the original artist did. Like, usually when somebody takes something over, even just the differences in style do that. And it's really odd that it's different but the same. I don't know too many people can do that.
Yeah, you see that on more recent Archie comics, that they're allowing their staff to add a little of their own style. It used to be they had to do the house style and nothing else.
Yeah.
I'm on the Fans of Archie Comics on Facebook, so I see a lot of different art by different artists.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting to see how they, take these iconic characters who we all know and then give it their own, slightly personal spin.
Yeah. That's interesting. So you're an Archie fan?
Not really, but I just knew some of the people that were doing the site, so I signed up for some weird things on Facebook.
So you haven't been reading the Afterlife with Archie series?
I would like to find that. The thing is, there didn't used to be a comic book shop convenient to me, but one opened in downtown Vancouver.
Okay.
And I need to visit more often. Right. And by the way, I say Vancouver, I mean Washington State, which is in the United States of America. Because outside of a very small regional area, if you say Vancouver anywhere on the West Coast, they immediately assume that you're a Canadian.
Yeah.
So I have to disabuse them of that. Although it's funny, my wife grew up in Bellingham, which is just a few miles south of the Canadian-American border. Well, a little more than that, maybe like a half hour south of that. Right. But she had a Canadian accent when I met her, which I thought was kind of cute. That's just an aside.
There's no such thing as a Canadian accent. I've never heard one.
Well, I guess I hear it because I'm from Texas. You probably don't hear it in me. I've been up here in the Northwest for about 25 years now, so less so for me.
Yeah.
No, but you sound very Texan.
Do I? Well, people still tell me that, although I don't hear it. I've been up here a long time, but yeah, my wife used to say things like "sorry" with the. I think that's for a Texan that doesn't sound right.
It goes both ways.
Yeah.
Up here in the Northwest, the accents are really flat, so people up here tend to notice accents from other regional areas more.
Right.
But if I tell people I'm from Vancouver, they assume I'm Canadian. And if I tell them, like when I was down in Texas, if I told them I was moving to Washington, they immediately assumed Washington, D.C., because Washington State on the West Coast just doesn't exist for them. It's like it's on the East Coast. Which is kind of odd. I'm in Washington State, Vancouver.
Typical East Coast attitudes.
Yeah, that's changing now. You're seeing more big business move to Seattle. Like Amazon just moved up there, so I think they're going to be on the map more or less. Actually, speaking of the 1980s, grunge kind of put Seattle on the map too.
Yeah.
That was another big thing that happened in the 80s.
Grunge and Starbucks.
Yeah.
And Starbucks. That's right. Starbucks is global now. They started down in near the Pike Place Market in Seattle in the 1980s.
Wow.
That explains Pike Place Roast, actually.
Huh.
Yeah, it's this really old kind of indoor-outdoor market down there, kind of vegetables, fresh fish, artwork, knickknacks, stuff like that. Kind of like your typical farmer's market type stuff. And there's a lot of little stores down there, Starbucks being one of them in the 1980s.
Weird. And now they're everywhere.
Oh, I guess they're in China.
Yeah.
Oh, they are. I can tell you from firsthand, they are.
And you have Starbucks in Canada, or is that is it Hortons? Have they supplanted Starbucks, or?
Oh, they'll never supplant
we've got
them.
both.
We have Starbucks in Canada now.
So you have your choice. You can do the homegrown coffee, or you can do the Seattle import.
Yeah, because
Sort of.
Really?
Sorry, Don, go.
Oh no, I was gonna say because at least like here in Windsor, there's a Tim Hortons like every 2 blocks.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yep. Same with London.
There is a street in downtown Portland, Oregon, and the 4 corners of the street, there's like 3 of those corners are Starbucks, and the other one is a Coffee People. So each of these 4 corners has a coffee shop on it, which is remarkable. And there's I think it's one of the universities down there, not too far away, which causes the foot traffic that will support those places.
Right. Yeah, here around our university, it's all bars. Make of that what you will.
They don't have the all-night coffee shops?
They do, but they're usually in the back of a bar somewhere.
Oh, okay. Well, then you can get your Irish.
Sorry to interrupt. We don't have the same, I guess you could call it, coffee shop culture here in Canada. In fact, it's really just starting right now, at least outside of Toronto. We're just really developing the coffee shop culture slowly here. It's not part of our natural, like to us, a coffee shop is Tim Hortons, which is not the same idea as the Starbucks type environment.
You don't go in and sit down and take your books and work on your homework.
It's taking its
time,
like but we're finally exactly.
You're getting there.
Yeah, here it's more like a truck stop.
If it's in the back, if you have a coffee shop in the back of a bar, at least you can get like a Irish coffee or something. Then I've always told Starbucks they should try that. Have the alcoholic additives for their coffee. That would make them even more popular.
Oh yes.
Interesting.
Okay, so why don't we put things back on the comic book track? So Jeff, why don't you tell us about your comic?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Well, we were talking about the 1980s, and that was one of the things that kind of facilitated my getting into comics was that not only were Xerox copy machines, kind of the photocopiers, available everywhere, are becoming more available and also cheap enough that anybody could access them. But the other big technological revolution was desktop publishing. And all of a sudden, you didn't have to like type things out on a typewriter and cut them out and do photocopies and paste them all together to make your originals. You could actually do stuff online. And that was, people take it for granted now. You can just sit down and do this kind of stuff on your laptop or whatever. But back in the 1980s, being able to edit in real time without whiteout or starting over again, it was a big deal. And I've still got some of my old pasted up originals. I mean, we did the Comics FX the old fashioned way. We had wax boards and we printed out, columns, and we Zoom copied illustrations, and we stuck them all down on the wax board, and then we peeled them off and stuck them down again until it all looked good. And then we took them down to the printer, and he took photos. They actually took photographic negatives of those for printing. But the desktop publishing is what really made it accessible to like your average college student. And that enabled me to do the comics that I did. And I was just looking through I did catalogs for all my comics, and I was looking through those, and I did mostly anthologies, science fiction anthologies, and a few superheroes and whatnot. But I guess what everybody remembers, and the one I'm kind of famous or maybe infamous for, is Snowbuni. And Snowbuni was, when I first developed the character, it was kind of a joke. It was a one-shot thing, and I tell you this story, but it's not like I've told a lot of people, is that actually the character was supposed to die halfway through their story. She's this super spy character, and she's in this James Bond environment. And there's always the scene in the James Bond film where the villain captures the spy, the super spy, and he says, "Now you will die," type thing. And Snowbuni was actually going to die, and then some of the other characters were going to finish the story. And I thought that was really unique and clever. And this is where kind of like the whole concept of community comes in, because everybody I showed it to, they hated it. They absolutely hated it. It's like, no, you can't do that. She can't die there. She has to finish the story. So I rewrote. It was 3 chapters. I rewrote the final chapter, and she survives, and she is victorious, and everybody liked that. But I think, Don, you were asking about, how, being in small press, how is that different from one of the majors? In that is that you get this kind of instant feedback.
Right. Because
the people you're working with and the people who are consuming your comic book, your little small press comic, it has a small press print run of below 100, maybe as few as 20 or 10. And all these people, they'll read through your comic and they will immediately tell you what they think of it, And that's how I kind of, that was the first story. And people kept asking me, well, when are you going to do more Snowbuni stories? So I would draw up these Snowbuni stories, and people would make suggestions. It's like, oh, you should do this and this. It's a super spy character. She's got to have, gadgets. She's got to meet good-looking guys. She's got to meet terrible villains. She's got to go to exotic places and have all these skills and adventures. And I always found that feedback really useful and very informative, because when you tell people that somebody's in a certain genre, they can immediately say, hey, we know this genre, and this is what your character should do or has to do, or what they can do. And it helps the whole shared world kind of develop much more rapidly than it would if it was a one-person operation.
Wait, when you say shared world, do you mean you had other people actually drawing Snowbuni stories?
Not only did I have other people drawing Snowbuni stories, but I also had other people doing the artwork for it. And I also had people actually volunteering like characters, like saying at one time, it was Sean Howell who suggested that she needed some kind of butler valet. So he designed this little robot, which we called Whister. And Whister is kind of her companion. And we found this character very useful, because not only was he there to do things for her, that like if she's a busy super spy agent, secret agent, she's going to need somebody to haul the equipment and be there to help her get into her gear and her weapons and stuff like that. But also, from a storytelling view, she could talk to Whister and tell him, this is the plan, and here's the recap, and stuff like that. So it was, as a storytelling device, he was very useful. And he was not my idea. That was Sean Howell who came up with him. And there was lots of characters. I tried to keep track of all the characters that people suggested to me, but I've kind of lost track. Like, I think her sisters, Honey Bunny and Snuggle Bunny, those were all suggested by other people. Her boss, Boris the Bear, was suggested by somebody else. I just incorporated these characters, and then we fleshed them out as we needed to for the story.
Wow, it's interesting.
So when did the aliens enter into it?
Well, actually, that's kind of an interesting thing. I tried to keep aliens out of it, but with kind of like Snowbuni and her people being the aliens on Earth, but they're a secret people that people are not aware of. And of course, Harry Potter kind of has the same backstory now, in that there's this secret society of people that the rest of the world doesn't know about. But Snowbuni did it first, way back when, kind of a secretive Illuminati type world society in the background.
Right. Now, was it like that from the very beginning, or was that something that got added a little later?
It was more like an anthropomorphic world at first, more like Zootopia, believe it or not. Everybody's an anthropomorph, but then I decided, we needed to expand out from there, and it kind of developed, it kind of evolved rather than it was a little bit random, and there are still elements in the whole gestalt that probably don't belong there, but we let it kind of develop naturally and go with it, whatever it did.
Right.
And I should mention, I started the first Snowbuni story. I started doing the artwork for it in 1984, so I've been doing this character for over 30 years now. I'm one of those people I mentioned earlier about the cartoonists who have like one character or one scenario, and then they work on it like their whole life. And I'm one of those people. It was never planned. It just worked out that way. People remember Snowbuni, and I've had people like I've been at a convention and people will come up to me and chat with me, and I'll tell them I'm Jeff Wood, and they'll say like, "Oh, I remember this Jeff Wood. He did a comic called Snowbuni," and it's like, "Yeah, that was me, Mea culpa." And they're like, I had one guy. It was really interesting. He says like, "You're Jeff Wood," and he started shaking my hand, and he wouldn't let go of my hand, and I'm like, and he's like, "Oh, you did the greatest comic." It was very flattering, but on the other hand, I'm kind of looking around like, hope nobody else is kind of watching this. The guy won't let go of my hand. But, yeah, most of the time when people say you're Jeff Wood, people come up and punch me in the mouth. But no, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so I have some notoriety just because I've been around so long, but also because of my writing for the Comics FX. Right. So people remember my reviews and stuff in there. And that's the other thing. A lot of the people that I associate with, they've actually been in cartoons for a long time, and they remember the Comics FX, even though it had a print run that started in the mid-'80s and went through about 1992 or thereabouts, kind of petered on until then, and then finally died.
Right. Because it's interesting that's the... it sounds like that's the thing that the professionals, or the people who later became professionals, remember. And then, like, say, the Snowbuni stuff is what the fans would remember.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering...
Well, you're probably right. The other thing about the 1980s was that, and Snowbuni was a part of this, it was kind of the development of anthropomorphic comics.
Yeah.
And there was a big movement. I mean, at first, I remember the first comic book convention I went to was the San Diego Comic Con down in San Diego, and this was like somewhere in the mid-'80s. And they had a furry party, and a furry party was just like a few professionals who happened to work in like animating furry comics or anthropomorphic comics, and it was very low key, and it was very professional. And then later on, several things happened. It was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles happened, and all of a sudden everybody knew Anthropomorphics because of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And that was everywhere. I mean, Burger King, that was their mascots for a while. So anybody eating fast food would be familiar with TMNT, and they had action figures, and they were on television. Mm-hmm. So a big leap forward for that whole genre, that whole furry anthropomorphic genre. But there was also other things that people who are not into comics or who were more into comics would be familiar with, and that was... one's comic books like Albedo, which was done by Steve Galacci, also in Seattle. Really? And it was yes, he was in Seattle. As a matter of fact, he was a member of Northwest Cartoonists Association, which I used to be a member of too when I was in Seattle. Huh. And actually, I'd go over to Ed's house, and occasionally Steve would be there too.
Wow.
But he did Albedo, which was a very serious, funny animal science fiction story. Mm-hmm. And there was no fluff about it at all. Steve was ex-military, and he was drawing on his experience, and he was a drafter as well, so he had the technical drawing skills as well as the military history to be doing this. And it was a big hit in the whole furry community. As a matter of fact, this whole group of fans started calling themselves furry, having been exposed to Albedo. As a matter of fact, there's a Usenet group called Alt Fan Furry, and it used to be called, as I recall, the original name for that was Alt Fan Albedo, and then they changed the name to Alt Fan Furry. And again, Usenet News was the original internet before the World Wide Web was really introduced. I think World Wide Web, what was that, 1994 or something like that, 93, somewhere in there. Yeah. But Usenet News was available online as early as 1984, because that's the first time I logged in. So that shows how old Albedo was, and its impact on the whole kind of anthropomorphic cartooning scene. Yeah. So a big thing there. And then the other one, which was very, very controversial for its time, was Reed Waller's Omaha the Cat Dancer. Also anthropomorphic characters, but with very adult situations, very explicit sexual situations. And another big impact there, as a matter of fact, there was a time like in the late 80s when a lot of anthropomorphic comics were like serious military comics, or they were X-rated comics, or they were a combination of the two. They were like X-rated military comics. And one example of that was a friend of mine, Tom Vare. He was doing a series called, he was originally to do the art for a series called Lesbian Foxes and Hover Tanks, which would have been kind of like your pornographic military hardware aficionado type thing. And that developed out of kind of like the interests of the furry industry. As a matter of fact, Reed Waller's success with adult comics kind of resulted in what we called the smut glut of the 1980s, the late 1980s, when there was like these tons of sexual comics available. And when people realized that you could sell a sexual comic and sell many thousands of copies, more so than your average, creator-owned title, then it's like everybody jumped on the bandwagon, and all of a sudden you had these really crappy, poorly drawn and poorly nuanced sex comics out there, and it kind of collapsed the industry for a while because a lot of the way to get these things, a lot of them was comic book specialty shops, and they would order these things and then they wouldn't be able to sell them, and eventually kind of that whole market collapsed, and it took down a lot of the specialty shops when it did. But I remember those two things, the military comics and the sex comics.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but that lesbian foxes in hover tanks, did that eventually become tank vixens?
Yes. There was some, as I recall, there was some question about who owned the property, and I think that's why it became tank vixens later on. Which I think was published, but I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, it was published. It was published by Antarctic Press. I actually read an issue or two of it. They don't, there's TNA, but there's no actual sex in it or anything. It's basically a weird comedy for the most part.
Yeah.
It was actually kind of cute.
There's two issues, and I remember that because that's one of my all-time favorite comics, just for the part where they explain how space travel works.
How do they explain space travel working?
There's like this 2-page strip where essentially it's like a consensual reality. So the whole idea of hyperspace and the stars going by real fast, it's just a tape that they play so that everybody's thinking along the same lines, and then that focus is what makes space travel work.
Oh, cool. Kind of like the Calvin and Hobbes theory of space-time. Get your cardboard box out and away you go.
Yeah, it's pretty much exactly that. And the little picture of all the guys watching the tape going, "Ooh, stars," is like one of my favorite scenes ever.
No, I haven't seen that comic, so I'm not familiar with that.
It's worth
it. Anyway, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, then the other one that kind of finished out the 1980s for me was Steve Mancusi's Fish Police. Because I mentioned this in the comments to one of your other shows, in that people were buying a lot of these comics assuming that, with the success of TMNT, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that there was all sorts of undiscovered properties which would yield vast popularity. So they were buying up these comics, like every time there was a #1 comic, somebody would purchase copies of it just in case, no matter what the title was. And also there were companies purchasing the rights to a lot of small press comics, just to ensure that they had the property rights in case that property became really popular, and there was money to be had from merchandising and advertising and action figures and all that other good stuff.
Yeah.
But Steve Mancusi's Fish Police was one of those that was optioned, and it actually became an animated series for 6 episodes, only 3 of which were ever shown on TV. And it didn't go over well. As a matter of fact, it was canceled, and that was the end of the whole free-for-all with the kind of speculating on the comic book properties.
Right.
So I kind of see this whole events. It kind of started with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That's where it started in the early 80s. And then it kind of petered out after Fish Police. That was that whole little 1980s comic book, small press, independent scene right there in a nutshell.
Because I think when you talk the Anthro stuff, it seems like the Anthro comics have always been super susceptible to trends.
Yes.
Because you've mentioned the three big eras, and if I can work backwards through them. And up until like the mid-90s, if you were doing an Anthro comic, it was a sex comic.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's because of Omaha, and it's a shame because the Omaha comic, it was really good. It was, especially when Kate Worley took over the writing. It was basically a soap opera, like you'd see on daytime TV, but where they didn't kind of shy away from the actual like sex. But it was an interesting story. It had interesting characters. Actually, as it went on, once you got past like issue 6 or 7, there wasn't very much sex or nudity in it at all. But that's what everybody remembered, and I think that's what after that you got what nowadays people would think of as like furry and that, where an Anthro character became cemented as a sex comic, like a sex story.
Mm-hmm.
And then you mentioned the military stuff. I know when Albedo came out in the early 80s, I know amongst the comic crowd, it was a really popular comic. And it was like super hard sci-fi, and you had a lot of the Anthro stuff that came out at that point that was going in that direction. Until like you said, the when the Ninja Turtles hit, especially after the cartoon, that became the direction that everybody went, and there were so many like Ninja Turtles ripoffs, and there was the radioactive black belt hamsters, and there was the pre-teen dirty jean kung fu kangaroos, and geriatric taekwondo toads. I made that last one up. I don't remember what all they had, but I remember a friend of mine in Seattle. He was collecting all those. They called them 3 adjective and a noun comics. They were all basically ripoffs of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Yeah.
Which actually inspired the comic series Boris the Bear by James Dean Smith. Mm-hmm. That started out as this teddy bear was going to rid the world of all these really crappy imitations, and he was going to literally like perform seppuku on them and cut them up.
I remember that.
Yeah, that was Boris the Bear. Yeah, he actually produced like 3 or 4 series up until I think the most recent one was like 2005, and they are all Boris the Bear kind of related things.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of I remember that so much that again that led up to the black and white glut that wiped out like the independent publishers by the end of the 80s pretty much.
Yeah, that was a big problem. Like in the late 80s, especially with the money coming in from speculators, there was a lot of people trying to get into publishing that really had no skills in art or scripting or anything else. And there was these comic books that would come out, and the specialty shops would order 1,000 of them or 500 or whatever they thought they could move, and they were terrible.
Yeah,
and it created this collapse in the market. But it did create kind of an opportunity for some collectors. Like I had some friends of mine that would deliberately go out and buy all the worst comics they could find on the shelves, like one copy of each one of them. Like I remember I think it was actually Steve Galachi who was doing this, but I might be mistaken. But he showed me one issue which was Inviso World. And the whole comic was blank except for the word balloons. There was no artwork at all because all the characters were invisible. So that was the concept behind that one.
In a weird way, that's kind of genius, actually.
Yeah. It certainly keeps down your overhead for artistic requirements.
Oh, man. That's terrible.
Yeah, that is.
But anyway, you can imagine, the comic book shops, they read the descriptions, in the big market books, and they have to order based on that. And then there's people that buy a number 1 issue of anything just because it may turn out to be a hot property. And then issue number 2 you'd be lucky to sell any of them, and by number 3, it's completely over, whatever it is.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that in the late 80s.
Yeah, and then that's kind of what led to, I know for the comic shops, with the Marvel and DC moving in, because those became like the sure money.
Exactly.
And then the speculators.
There was a trend back toward the big names.
Yeah. Up until the 90s, when all the speculators moved on and the whole industry collapsed altogether, pretty much.
There were some comic book shops that did all right, though, like Dark Horse. They produced a quality product, and they were able to survive and become one of the majors. Antarctic Press was another one. I mean, they started doing mini comic type stuff, and now they do some pretty large print runs. The more recent one that I'm aware of is their Warrior Nun property, and I've actually seen some footage that they've shot, real life footage of potential scenes from a movie option. Yeah,
wow.
I think you can go to YouTube and look for Warrior Nun, and these are like professional Hellboy type movie clips, where she's in the church and all of a sudden these satanic figures loom out of the darkness and she uses swords and weapons to take them down.
Wow, I had no idea. I thought that comic had kind of died out after the Image boom.
Yeah.
Well, it's one of those things, these properties, a lot of them don't die and they just kind of simmer for a while, and when somebody has an interest in them and the ability to produce something like a movie, I don't think they are actually making a movie, but they were making these test sequences, and they're very professional. They look great.
Right.
Well, they're probably there to generate Kickstarter interest for some crowdfunding campaign.
Yeah.
That's probably true. I'm not aware of this myself, though. But that brings me to another point, and that was YouTube publishing. Mm-hmm. And I think I mentioned this as well. Yeah, YouTube publishing for comic book type stuff. There's a lot of people who do these little animations with YouTube, and they actually produce their own serialized cartoons and or parodies and or music videos. And some of them have hundreds of thousands of hits, enough so that the income from advertising allows them to live independently, that they don't have to actually work. They can just do their cartoons and their commentary and their music videos.
Huh. I'd never heard of this.
Oh, really? Look up Minecraft music video, or look up My Little Pony videos. There's people producing original content for both of those.
Okay, sorry. I thought you meant they were publishing comics through YouTube or something, but you mean actual the playthroughs and animated stuff. Okay, I do know about that.
And those people that are doing that are starting to move into original creator-owned content. Right. And also, I've seen some adaptations of some older things, I mentioned Morty the dog the other day, and I happened to look on YouTube, and darned if there isn't Morty the dog videos, somebody basically reading and cheaply animating some of the Morty the dog sequences. Now, Morty the dog was in a little mini comic by Steve Willis, and it was kind of a satire, social satire. And it was a little bit crude. Morty the dog is a naked dog with a very prominent penis, but he shows up. He did a lot of comic books, and he actually did. The reason I remember him in particular is because he did a just absolutely gorgeous interpretation of Hamlet using all of his Morty the dog characters.
Okay.
And I was at UW, and I took in some of these mini comics featuring. They were actually, strictly. They took the play Hamlet by William Shakespeare, and he substituted his own characters for all the parts, and he did a beautiful job. And I showed these to the people in my class at the University of Washington, where I was going to school at the time, and everybody agreed he'd done a very accurate job of portraying the play. So much so, our teacher notes that there's one scene where the characters are all on stage, but one of them announced that somebody is arriving, and the professor says, "This is an error. William Shakespeare should not have put this into his story because this character could not have known that." Well, we looked at the mini comic, and Steve Willis resolved this problem by having the character look out a window.
Oh, wow.
Thinking, well, there's a solution to that the professor teaching William Shakespeare had not thought of. So, beautiful. I don't know if those are still available.
They should.
But if you can find those on eBay or something, or just go to YouTube and look for Morty the dog, and you can see kind of the weird psychedelic observations that Morty the dog kind of represents.
That's why him doing Shakespeare is just so weird.
And actually a pretty good job too.
Wow. Because that gets to the thing that I've always wondered, because I know nowadays for doing comics with web comics and that, it's a big boom period. But it's that trick of how do you make it a career?
Well, there's one person I know that's done that, and he's doing quite well, and that's Phil Folio. I knew Phil from Seattle. He was another Seattle resident while I was there. And at the time, he was doing Myth Adventures with, I think, Robert Asprin, who is the writer for that series.
Right.
And then a little later during the Smut Glut, he was doing Xenophile, which is spelled XXXENOPHILE, Xenophile,
right,
which is an X-rated comic sex with aliens type thing.
Mm-hmm.
And of all the Smut comics out there, it was probably one of the better ones because it was, beautifully illustrated. Mm-hmm. But he's doing a web comic now called Girl Genius. Yeah, and I spoke to him at one of the recent Emerald City Comic Cons in Seattle, Washington. And he tells me Girl Genius really struggled for a while, but they didn't make money on it until they gave it away for free. Mm-hmm. And I go, huh? And he says, well, what they did is they used to try to hide the webcomic behind paywalls, and that didn't work. There wasn't enough traffic. But eventually what they did is they made the webcomic absolutely free online. Anybody can go look at it. And then they sold the compilations, the graphic novels, for cash money, dollars.
Right.
And they do this at conventions, and they do it online and whatnot. And they're beautifully printed, and that's where they make their money. The webcomic is absolutely free, but if you want the printed edition, it'll be $12.95 plus tax plus shipping. Or whatever.
And because there's just enough fans, because of it being free, even if only, say, 5 to 10% actually buy the printed versions, that's still a large number. That's still a large number of printed copies sold.
I don't know what his circulation is, but I do know that he brings big cases of these comics to the conventions.
Wow.
And he has fans. As a matter of fact, it's getting hard to speak to Phil Folio at a convention, because if you go to his table, he's always surrounded by these fans. And Girl Genius, his webcomic, is a steampunk adventure. So
yes,
all these fans are dressed up in top hats, and they've got gears, and they've got lots of chrome and brass and wood mechanical appliances. They've got phones made out of wooden boxes with crank handles, and they've got firearms that have big glass bulbs on them and brass flared muzzles and whatnot. So they're all in character, and it's all very beautifully done. The people that are into the steampunk thing put a lot of effort into their costumes. Like I saw a girl once, she had butterfly wings, and these are mechanical butterfly wings, and there's this spinning mechanical gear thing on the back that would make the butterfly wings operate and whatnot. Huh. But that was his way of making money on it, was to sell the printed publication, and yet the webcomic was just kind of like the advertising for his printed publication.
Right. Also, I imagine he's also making money on the merchandising. That's where a lot of webcomics guys make their money, actually, is on the merchandising side.
I haven't seen any merchandising for that, but there may be that.
Oh, I'm sure if we go to his site, there's probably a ton of Girl Genius stuff that's available. T-shirts, pens, cups, whatever, you name it.
Yeah, I've seen some.
Oh, well, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I've seen some stuff like that. Not a huge amount, but...
Also, since he's got the website, he probably sells advertising space.
Yeah.
Yes, he can do that
I don't
too.
Know if and if you're like if you have things on YouTube, and this is the beautiful thing about YouTube, is that you can allow YouTube to post ads on your site, and you get for every view that you get a certain number of pennies, and you get several million clicks. That's quite a few pennies.
Yeah.
Although I don't think that he has anything on YouTube.
Not yet.
He might.
No.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there is something on there. I bet Phil does have a YouTube channel.
You know, Phil's one of those guys. There are certain guys that you look at their properties and you're going like, why isn't this a cartoon, like an animated cartoon already? I mean,
Right,
it could
yeah.
be. It's got all this beautiful background and setting and scenes and characters, and it would just make a great cartoon. I'd love to watch it. You know, it's one of those things that you'd want to watch, but yet it doesn't exist. So
I'm surprised.
yeah, it would seem like, you know, especially when somebody's done most of the groundwork that would need to be done for a new cartoon, that especially you could put together like a little like demonstration reel and say, hey, this is what the character in the cartoon would look like.
Again, yeah, these days with crowdfunding, all Phil needs to do is say, yeah, we want to make a short animated Girl Genius thing, and we need, like, say, $50,000 to do it or something like that. Within a month or so, he'd probably have all that money or more.
Given his fan base, he'd probably have 500,000 or something.
Yeah, he could probably put together a full internet series or something like that if he really wanted to. Always
and put it on YouTube.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then that's a passive income. You know, every time somebody clicks on it, he gets money.
Yeah.
Well, you have to go beyond a certain number of clicks, I think, or views before you actually make money off it, really.
Yeah.
That's absolutely correct.
I mean, so that's...
I don't doubt that a quality product, though, would reach that. And that's the thing. There's so much crap on YouTube that it's, you know, if you post something that's relatively entertaining and is well made, I can't imagine that you wouldn't get a following.
Yeah. Well, even then, though, there's so much stuff. I think a lot of it comes down to a crapshoot.
Yep, pretty much.
Yeah, there's an element of luck. That is true. But I think, you know, people who are lucky are the ones who work at it the longest and the hardest. You know, part of that luck is just being there and keeping at it.
Yeah.
The ones who stay in the game the longest. And Phil is professional.
Yeah.
He's been doing this game for a long time.
Well,
yes, he has.
Like 82 or 83 was when What's New started in the Dragon.
Yeah.
I don't remember I came in at Myth Adventures. I know he was a professional even before then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Myth Adventures would have been around that same time. He probably got the Myth Adventures cover gig because he was doing What's New in Dragon, I guess. Maybe I have it backwards.
No, because Myth Adventures would have been, I want to say, 84 or 85, somewhere around there.
Yeah, early 80s.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he did like Buck Godot before that. Am I correct? Am I remembering correctly?
I don't know if it was before or if it was more or less the same time. Because
that was his one of his properties, his early properties.
Yeah, I remember those too.
Yeah, Buck Godot was great.
Yeah. But that was true.
I never collected that series, but I've seen images from it. It looks interesting.
Yeah, the one he did there are a few original series, like there's Smith with PSI Smith and that. But the one that's worth buying is there's a series he did called the Gallimaufry, I believe it's called, and that is amazing. There's actually literally no other way to describe it. It's one of the best science fiction stories I've ever read. And it was like a 12-issue series. I've got the original comic versions, but I think there might be a collection kicking around.
Gallimaufry.
I think it's called the Gallimaufry, which is it's got this really weird long name. I can put a link in the show notes. But
I'm not familiar with that one.
Gallimaufry. Yeah, it was called, and it's everyone, like, it's one of those things that nobody had read it, so I would go around with my collection of all 12 issues. I just shoved them into my friend's hands saying, here, read this. And then they'd all read it, and they'd be like, this is the most amazing thing ever. And slowly it worked its way through my circle of friends, at least here in London, that way. And so after that, whenever we played role-playing games, there would constantly be Buck Godot jokes and stuff like that, because... Yeah, it was just so amazing and so influential. Again, to anyone who had read it.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, we're familiar with it. So really, if you get the chance, the Buck Godot, the Gallimaufry, I believe it's called the Gallimaufry, because that's the name of this giant space station thing.
Mm-hmm.
It came out, I believe, during the same time when there were those shows like Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5. There was kind of a glut of science fiction space station shows for a while. And it was kind of like that, done 100 times better, and only in 12 issues.
Uh-huh.
So he really took that concept and really ran with it. It was truly amazing. If you ever get the chance to read it, it's a fantastic work.
I wonder if Phil has ever considered, keeping all of his old properties in constant publication, at least in an on-demand situation. It seems to me that there's probably some money to be made there.
Yeah.
People find his webcomic online and then want to find out what else he has done, and they could go and buy a copy of these other books.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like free money because he's already put in all the effort and produced them.
Yeah, it is amazing that all these artists, especially even the people you've been talking about in our show so far, don't just basically scan everything they own and stick it up on websites or stick it up on there's Drive-Thru RPG. I think there's Drive-Thru Comics. Like there are sites where you can sell PDFs or EPUBs or whatever of comics that you put up.
Yeah.
Digital editions.
Or
So
just do it
I'm
from your
surprised
own.
more people of the old guard aren't doing that actually. Maybe
They might not be. They might not be aware of it either. I mean, the whole internet thing is kind of a new mindset.
Mm-hmm. It is. That's
it
true.
used to be you did a publication, then it was done. But with web publishing, it's never done. You can always go back and just revise it and then repost it.
Yeah.
That's very true. But that also has an advantage, right? Once you put it up there, it's literally just sitting there passively making you money.
Yeah.
Yes, that's passive income.
Yeah, passive income is a wonderful thing.
That's that whole rich dad, poor dad concept. And I don't know if you've heard of this publication. There's a guy in America anyway who does these seminars, and it's called the Rich Dad, Poor Dad theory. And basically, it boils down to you must have passive income. If you're doing active income, that means you're going to work and you're punching the clock. And if anything should happen to you, like you call in sick one day, well, you're not punching the clock, you're not getting money. But if you have passive income, you could stay home and watch TV, you're still making money. And the people who are rich, they all have sources of passive income. That's what they do. They set up this passive income. And as creators, we ought to do the same thing. We put our work into developing these franchises, and then we ought to set it up so that we can make passive income from them.
Yep.
And the internet makes that easy. It gives you that worldwide audience.
It absolutely does. There's actually a podcast called the Smart Passive Income Podcast that I've listened to from time to time. And what he does is every week he interviews a different person who's actually making money through passive income and talks to them about how they did it and how they succeeded at it. He's talked to people doing pretty much everything you can name. And I think he might have even I know he's talked to novelists. I don't know if he's talked to comic guys. Maybe he's talked to webcomic guys too. I'm not sure. But he's got like over, I think, 200, 300 episodes of this show of him talking to people who have done that and are making money doing it, and tips on how to do it. And there's a real art to it. There's an absolute art to the passive income thing. For some people can just literally stick stuff online and make money at it. Other people, they have to work at it a little more. But it is an option. You're right. It's something that smart people actually, or people who can anyway, should be trying to do.
It seems to me that if you went to a site like YouTube and you published something which was episodic, like every couple of weeks you published like a new chapter, and it was like a short vignette or something of your characters, and it was well done and it was interesting, that over time you would accrue a pretty substantial following, provided that you kept updating the story. And eventually it would get to the point where it would be self-supporting, because you'd have enough people watching and subscribed that it would continue generating more and more money all the time, because you have a larger and larger archive of work available for people to click on.
Yep, definitely. So why don't we just call this, part one, and we'll have you back on to talk more about this stuff at some point in the future, Jeff.
Okay, that sounds good, and that way I can review what we've said and do some kind of self-analysis here and find out how I've done.
Because I think we've done a pretty good job of covering like the 1980s independent comics scene, which I think will be a great focus for this episode.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good, and we could talk about small press next time, because that's one thing I didn't really cover quite as much. I talked about independence quite a lot.
Yes, definitely, and I think there's a whole, that's almost a whole other show in and of itself. Do you agree, Don?
Yeah, because I think the idea, we got to the point about the publishing online, And I think in some ways that loops back to the small press thing, and I think that could be a whole other discussion.
Yeah, I think we kind of went full circle on this one in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
So, Jeff, you brought us right around. Perfect.
Excellent.
Well timed.
Well, I tell you what, I enjoyed speaking with you both, and hope I've provided some input, some clarity to some of the topics that we discussed.
Oh, you absolutely have, sir. You absolutely have. Thank you very much.
Outstanding. Well, I look forward to speaking with you again.
And to you, too. We hope to have you on the show again, Jeff. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah.
Oh, outstanding.
Good time.
And excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so on that note, I think we're going to bring this episode of the Department of Nerdly Affairs to a close. I'm going to usurp Don's hosting duties and bid everyone a good night. Thank everyone for listening. And tune in next episode when we'll talk about, well, it's a surprise.
Holiday special. Holiday special.
Shh. No holiday special. On that note, good night, folks, and we'll see you next episode. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.